Dark times have befallen your land. You have gathered a warband of your most trusted allies, with weapons lasting and costing a small fortune on your backs and strapped to your arms. Rumors abound of a village burned nearby, of kinsmen and family scattered and destroyed, and even worse, of a weapon ensorcelled in the hands of your enemies. You emerge from the woods to battle your foes, only to find your weapons, those that cost a fortune, those that you had cast your hope and life upon, shatter. This was the reality in the Iron Age. Hello everyone, I am Kyle and welcome to Desks and Dorks. Today we are going to be covering one of my favorite historical time periods, the Iron Age. Before we get into that, however, a few things. If you want to support us and the mission that we have here at Desks and Dorks to bring you great role-playing games, the best ways to do so, all of the YouTube pleasantries. That QR code will take you to our itch.io page if you would like to get a PDF. There are links in the description below if you would like a physical copy. And I am again going to give a shout out to our new partners over at Tabletop Bookshelf, who are carrying some Desks and Dorks games in physical form. I will continue to sing the praises of a small retailer doing everything right and trying their best to work with people within the independent role-playing game scene. If you want Desks and Dorks games at a reasonable price from a great business, you can go no further than Tabletop Bookshelf. They're a fantastic group of people to work with. With that out of the way, let's talk about what we'll be covering. Today we will be covering the Iron Age. Again, one of my all-time favorite periods in history. This is a large, very systemic, and very important time in human history. One that is often underrated, unsung, and ultimately the best setting, I think, if you are going to do a traditional fantasy role-playing game. We're going to be covering some of those larger systemic movements, why it's a perfect era for adventuring, Iron Age rules in our games, as well as covering misconceptions and a Q&A section at the end of the video. A couple important caveats, however. I was a Eurocentric medievalist. That was my training. I am going to be leaving out several different sections of the world. I tried my best to incorporate a global viewpoint because the Iron Age is a global movement. However, I am most likely going to miss some things. I did try my best because those cultures, those time periods, they are worth interacting with. One more thing, there is a lot of horrific stuff that goes on in the Iron Age. If you are going to throw that at your players, please make sure that you are using some safety tools and that you are checking in to make sure that your players feel okay and comfortable at your table. And lastly, the Iron Age lasts a long time, roughly 1500 BCE, all the way to the mid-500s. That means that I'm going to be covering close to 1,000 years, a little over 1,000 years of human history. This video is going to specifically deal with the early Iron Age following the Bronze Age collapse. And that, again, is that window of time that I think is truly perfect for historic gaming. With that out of the way, let's talk about upheaval, because if there's one thing that is going to characterize the Iron Age as a historic movement and a backdrop for your role-playing games, I think truly you can go no further than the word upheaval when talking about what makes this age so important as a historical time period. For once, I will not be mentioning the fall of the Roman Empire. Usually, when I am talking about medieval settings, this is the big thing. This is the spark that kicks off the explosion of the Middle Ages. It is not going to be the thing that we are talking about today. However, what's very interesting is, despite the fact that Rome is not the main catalyst, it's the fall of literally everything else. There is a massive loss in mercantile endeavors, in political institutions, and in infrastructure. During the Bronze Age collapse and into the Iron Age, you have massive metropolis areas being leveled, whether it is by disease, famine, political insurrections, or just straight up good old-fashioned warfare and disease. With the loss and destruction of many of those cultures and cities comes with it a loss of political institutions, things like ruling councils, things like democracies, and functioning government bureaucracies all fall by the wayside during the Iron Age and into the late Iron Age. Now, not only does this mean that there is a loss of rights and political participation, it also means a massive loss of infrastructure. This includes roads and schools, but it also includes farming technologies and innovations that help to keep people fed. This also means a loss of mercantile endeavors. So things such as ports or shipping lanes that had been properly maintained and protected, whether those are from, the depredations of bandits and pirates, or just the good old-fashioned attacks of Mother Nature, they wind up being lost during this Iron Age. And here's the big thing that often gets just sort of glossed over. With the loss of that infrastructure becomes goods of less standardized quality. This means that not only are you unable to get luxury goods that you may have enjoyed, but simple things like tools and weapons become harder to regulate, food becomes of dubious quality, and travel becomes far, far, far more dangerous. This is especially difficult and very terrifying because at the time of the Bronze Age collapse, many of these sections of the world were dependent on food imports from elsewhere in the planet. If you watched our Bronze Age video, which I would encourage you to do so, you will know that this is a time that is defined by a true global sense of mercantilism, and there are entire superpowers that are dependent on the import of grain and other foodstuffs that fall during the Bronze Age as a consequence of losing those mercantile endeavors. Now, what this means, and what this is even worse for, is that means that many of those cities, those settlements, those kingdoms, those starve in the face of losing those sort of mercantile throughways, those trade pathways, if you will. And as a result, you have an incredible amount of depopulation, of destruction, of disease, and of desperation. And yes, I threw all of those D words off the dome, all happening all at once. It is an incredible loss of not just political institutions, but of mercantile institutions and of the very things that help keep people alive. It is a terrifying thing, and we actually have archaeological evidence of cities that were booming to the size of some modern cities that were left basically abandoned within a span of a year during the Bronze Age collapse and into the Iron Age. Now, on top of the famine, which does actually winds up coming in as one of the big movers and shakers of this age, you have massive ecological upheaval, because not only is the famine brought about by the destruction of those trade routes, whether those be land-based trade routes or sea-based trade routes, but around the time of the Bronze Age collapse, there is a global temperature fluctuation. Now, there are those of you people who are going to say that, humanity tends to go through temperature fluctuations in general. This is true for the most part, although currently we are in the middle of a man-made temperature crisis, the likes of which has never been seen historically. This is actually a close second to the one that we're going into right now. It's a global cooling that was not actually not only understood, but it wasn't expected. And with that global cooling came massive amounts of changes to the way that people farmed, to the way that people took care of crops. With those changes to crops, it also meant a death of livestock on a massive scale. And again, this, coupled with the destruction of those trade routes and trade networks, led to massive amounts of starvation. Not only did it happens, the starvation occurs, but we have evidence of cannibalism in Bronze Age settlements, or late Bronze Age settlements, and early Iron Age settlements. Although this is conjecture, as a lot of some archaeological finds are, it seems likely that this was in response to the lack of food and lack of opportunities to get food to survive as a result of both the collapse of these infrastructural networks and as a result of the global ecological climate collapse that they were in the part of. It does seem that as the Iron Age continues, mankind begins to develop new farming techniques as a way to sort of address the global cooling. New stuff like crop rotation, for example, or deeper plows, steel plows, metal plows, iron plows, which we'll get into in a little bit. But all of those things come perhaps too little too late for those who experience the beginning of the Iron Age. It's essential for us as game masters to understand that this is a time of destruction, a time of upheaval, and a time of cataclysmic change. But it also comes at the expense of military upheaval. There's a number of different reasons that the military winds up being absolutely destroyed. I have pulled up, of course, a picture of ancient Rome because they are the ones to do roads best, but that's not actually going to be what we're talking about here. But we are going to talk about the loss of roads in general. the loss of an infrastructural network like this, like roads or like ports, means it is incredibly difficult. It is actually impossible during the early Iron Age to transport soldiers on the scale that they would have been found in the Bronze Age. Gone are the massive armies of Egypt or the Mycenaeans. Gone are the massive armies of places like Sargon or Akkad or Assyria. Gone are those types of military conflicts. And partially it has to do with a loss of infrastructure, but also partially it has to do with a loss of settlements. Places need to have a vast population in order to support a vast army, not just because you need room to house your soldiers, but because you need individuals who are able to provide those soldiers the necessary services for them to continue on a campaign effectively. This means the food for your forces, the water for your forces, as well as the sundry pack animals. This means the craftsmen that go to maintaining their goods. This goes to the people who are skilled artificers, skilled individuals who could not only repair and patch weapons, but make new ones or make new gear or equipment as time goes on, to the people like scribes who were in charge of making sure that soldiers got paid. All of these systems fall apart when you have a massive amount of depopulation and a massive amount of starvation in the face of the Bronze Age collapse and into the Iron Age. This makes fielding the armies of the Bronze Age basically a physical impossibility. And not only that, but with the change to those logistics, especially with the loss of writing. We talked about the loss of those political institutions shortly before, but I know some people are like, who cares if the bureaucrats die? But those of you who have studied history closely will know when a bureaucracy starts to become so bloated and corrupt, or when a bureaucracy is completely and totally destroyed, it basically spells doom for military logistics pretty soon after, unfortunately. Troops, shockingly enough, want to be paid, they want to be fed, and they want to be led effectively. All of that is impossible when there is a collapse of writing, a collapse of educated individuals, and a collapse of the monetary and mercantile systems that go to supporting these massive Bronze Age armies. All of this goes by the wayside when we get to the Iron Age, and I'll be completely honest, even more than logistics, many of those soldiers, the bravest, the best, the most well-equipped, and the most experienced, shall we say, most well-trained, wind up perishing in the conflicts that lead to the Iron Age, whether they are defending against invasion and incursion, whether that's by desperate individuals moving into those cities looking for food or looking to escape other desperate individuals. We have massive diaspora of numerous different barbarian tribes at this time, or just tribes in general, because let's be real here, you're only a barbarian if you don't come from the place that you're immigrating to for opportunities. That happens basically a lot, and we wind up with these giant clashes that occurs. Many of those soldiers die defending these cities, not from enemy bows and arrows or swords, but from starvation, from disease, and from malnutrition. All of those things happen, and with it means a loss of massive military might. And again, in a few times that we get pitched combat during the Iron Age, or at least during the early Bronze Age or the Bronze Age collapse into the early Iron Age, they are cataclysmic and they are total, which means that by the time that we get to the Iron Age, many of these great standing armies have been wiped out, or at the very least they have been stripped of some of the greatest warriors, tacticians, and leaders amongst them, leaving them far more bare and far less equipped for the battles to come. But now we have to talk about the iron in the room. There is perhaps, up until we had bronze, there is perhaps nothing more effective than iron as a type of technological advancement in human history at this time. We can easily talk about the importance of iron as a weapon. In terms of its abilities, it is very similar to bronze. It has a similar malleability and hardness, but it is harder than bronze. It actually manages to dent and dull bronze weapons. This lovely YouTube channel right here actually did a field test of this. It's actually crazy how effective iron was at stopping bronze weapons and dulling the edges of a bronze sword while continuing to keep its edge. It's no doubt that over a long battle, an army or a force equipped with iron weapons probably would have overwhelmed bronze-wielding soldiers. But not only is it similarly malleable, it is cheaper and faster to produce, which means that it is far easier to equip an entire force with it. And because it is cheaper to make, faster to produce, and more importantly, more widespread, it winds up changing everything, not just on the battlefield, but at the homestead. We have so much evidence of things like iron combs or iron farm implements that it is clear to any historian, even somebody with a passing understanding of the ancient eras, that iron winds up being a global change to everything and everyone that it touches. Now, again, I hate to say that things happen almost overnight, because that's a huge misnomer, especially in the historical fields. But if there is a technology, if there is a substance that does change human history overnight, other than fire, it's probably the introduction of iron. Not even guns, which took forever to adapt, especially in the West. Shout out to the Tercio time period, where we have like knights and pikemen with like rudimentary muskets. Underrated period of history, kind of based. But other than fire itself, there is no other thing that sort of changes the way that human beings live on such a massive scale so quickly. Iron is perhaps, rather than just disease, logistical collapse, the mercantile end of the world, famine, climate change, iron is the last and perhaps greatest upheaval of this age. But I made a very bold claim at the beginning of this video. I told you that I thought the Iron Age was the best period in time for fantasy role-playing games, and I'm going to stand by that. I believe that whether you are playing something like Dungeons and Dragons, or if you're branching out into other systems, kind of better systems, things like Flayo, Shadow of the Demon Lord, perhaps even you want to engage in something like Jackals, a wonderful Bronze Age RPG, and maybe you want to expand it into the Iron Age. I think all of these games are set, or could be set, during the Iron Age with very little change at all to the tropes or to the importance of the player characters. And I'm going to go over a number of historical reasons so that you will stop scratching your heads, and by the end of this video, you might be like, Kyle might honestly be onto something. So the first one that we need to talk about is the scale of the conflict. During our section on upheavals, I mentioned that the era of the Great Army is over. Now, there are still great standing armies during this time period, to be sure, but it's far more centered on warbands led by charismatic leaders, on small elite forces of soldiers that have gathered together to take key areas or to emerge from the shadows and strike fear into the hearts of their enemies and then disappear, having achieved a lot of loot. I wonder what that sounds like. Doesn't that sound kind of like an adventuring party? And in a lot of ways, it very much is an adventuring party. So much so that some Iron Age explorers, conquerors, and soldiers referred to themselves as adventurers. Not only do these sort of historical warriors line up with the things that our player characters do in a traditional fantasy role-playing game, but because the scale of conflict is so much smaller, there is an opportunity for individual accomplishments, for individual achievements, and for individual talents to sway the tide of history and the tide of battle. But we also have things like close to magic weapons. I mentioned in the beginning narration the horror, the shock of having your bronze weapons shatter or dull in the face of your opponent's iron ones. In many ways, to those who were being introduced to this new technology, or to those who still used bronze weapons, because, fun fact, bronze weapons and iron weapons did actually still exist and coexist for some time during the Iron Age. This was a horrific find to realize that your weapons were far less effective and far less dangerous than your opponents. Again, they carry a kind of magical capability. We also have some examples of meteorite weapons as well. Now, these are far less common than pop culture would have us believe. Pop culture loves the idea of the meteorite weapon. We can talk all about Dawn from Game of Thrones, or Sokka's katana from Avatar if you want some great examples of meteorite weapons in fiction, but there are some examples of meteorite weapons, a type of rudimentary steel, so something that is better than iron as well, that exists, and it's entirely plausible and possible that there are meteorite weapons your players could encounter that act kind of like magical weapons in a classical setting. By the way, we have some really nifty pictures, I don't believe this is one of them, of meteorite daggers that belonged to the Egyptian pharaohs. I do think that is pretty interesting, but it's not just the metal of this time period that actually gets involved. You see, one of the cool parts of my research for this video, and my research just in general as somebody who wanted to be a practicing practicing historian and, got pretty close. I'd like to think I'm still practicing at least a little bit, is that wood during times of cataclysmic climate change can change its properties as well. And it's not very far off the mark to say that perhaps there are some things going on with your wood in your campaigns, pause for phrasing, that could change the impact of those weapons on the characters. This is actually where I get to talk a little bit about conjecture here, but we have two examples of how the chemicals and ecological change affects wood, and one of the best examples for this happens in the form of Stradivarius violins. Everybody, this is Joseph Nagvari. He is a professor with Texas A&M. He proved, by the way, without a shadow of a doubt, that one of the reasons that the Stradivarius violins sound the same is due to a twofold factor. One is something ecological. At the time the Stradivarius violins were being made, there were worm infections in wood that were far more commonplace as a result of some climate and ecological changes that were going on at the time. As a result of those wood infections, violin makers and carpenters in general would constantly treat and soak wood in a mixture of chemicals, thus altering the chemical composition of the wood over time. Those chemicals sat, and the result changed the sound of the wood itself. In addition to this, I found another wonderful piece of evidence using those Stradivarius violins. This is Professor Francis W.M.R. Schwarze. He is from the Swiss Federal Laboratories, and he actually was able to recreate the sound of a Stradivarius violin with a normal wooden violin by exposing that wood to fungal infections. Now we enter into the conjecture zone. Because this is not proof, by the way, or nor is it true, but these are good examples of how ecological changes and ecological factors, whether we're talking about fungus, worms, or the homemade chemical remedies of craftsmen, and what they can do to alter the properties of wood. Again, this next part is conjecture. This is not fact. However, I do think it is plausible and perhaps possible that you could have Iron Age weapons that are of a similar type of wood that are maybe better, more effective, and more deadly. If we're going off of all of this stuff, these would feel like magic weapons to your average player character. So it's another sort of tick right in the favor of the Iron Age as an age of heroic adventure. Also, the great heroes and stability are gone in a time of disease, starvation, military destruction, and massive, vast diaspora. The great heroes are finished. Those that had stood against the cataclysms of the world are either unalived or exiled or have gone into hiding to protect themselves and their families, which means that not only are the dangers great, not only do the characters have to face all types of untold horrors, but guess what? There is nobody else to do it. It is an age that wants heroes to step forward and step into the light, not just for their own safety and their own glory, but perhaps to save the world, which is probably what it felt like if you were a person living through the Iron Age. It's an age of opportunity as well. What do adventurers go looking for, right? No random adventurer is going to go out because things are stable. Like, you're not going to go fight a hungry vampire in a cave when you have a loving wife and a successful vineyard at home. You're going because everything around you is burning down and you have to do something to either survive, thrive, or perhaps secure a future for yourself, right? You're not going to adventure if your life is going amazing. You're going to adventure if there is no other opportunity, or if the opportunities presented are far greater than what would happen if you stayed where you're at. But not only is this, there's tons of opportunity for questing during this time, right? The destruction of so many libraries and so many houses of learning meant that information was almost as valuable as gold, and we have incredible stories of people going on adventures during this time to look for things like maps, lost blueprints, lost schematics, or even things like medical practices and architectural secrets that could be brought back to the benefit of your civilization. all of this means that there is a desire for information. And speaking of information, because of the loss of those vast metropolitan areas that we have talked about, cities need to know what is going on around them, and it's not like they have the standing military forces to actually do the surveying. So they 100% would and 100% did contact and contract mercenary bands, roving adventurers, and ne'er-do-wells to do that job for them. If you want to know what's going on and you are pretty sure that the cities are starting to burn somewhere, you need to know what's happening, which means that adventurers would have been called upon in order to, again, figure out the infrastructure of what is around them, but to explore. And because there's so much actually happening in terms of warfare and disease, in terms of exile and massive, vast, civilization-wide diaspora, guess what? The ruins, the catacombs, the dungeons that everybody loves, they're commonplace during this time. One of the things that myself and other people have railed at when we talk about Dungeons & Dragons is, surely there can't be that many dungeons everywhere. Surely there's not that many ruins everywhere. Guess what? During the Iron Age, there is, which means that you could stumble upon the ruins of a burning village, the vast crumbling edifices of a city, the final remnants of a destroyed temple. There's so many things that your characters can explore because it's everywhere, because so many of those important structures, cities, villages, towns, had to be abandoned, destroyed, or were overtaken by others during this time. If you were looking for an all-you-can-eat catacomb smorgasbord, congratulations, friends. You have found it in the Iron Age. And not only that, but are you looking for a bunch of different enemies that your adventurers can fight? Well, boy, oh boy, do I have a deal for you. This is the age of bandits. This is the age of roving warbands, of conquering armies, of desperate exiles and refugees looking for home and seeking protection and solace wherever they can find it. This is the time where you are going to run into those groups. Seriously, the Iron Age is like Skyrim on crack. Not a sentence I thought I would say as an adult man, but it's true, right? You have roaming bands of warriors and conquerors just roaming around looking for loot, or looking in some cases for a place to call home. Also, though, because we have lost so much information during this time, you, as somebody from one section, would have to come to grips with rediscovering new, exotic, and potentially dangerous animals as well. Animals that you might have thought were extinct or were lost to the knowledge of your kingdom or the empire that your character hails from could be something that you encounter. And to somebody in the Iron Age, this must have been like discovering a monster for the first time. And it's in fact, again, this is conjecture, but I find it entirely likely from a sociological and anthropological viewpoint to think, wow, maybe, just maybe, the discovery of, or rediscovery, or reintroduction of new and exotic animals, or animals that perhaps your culture knew existed but had been faded from the cultural consciousness with the loss of that information during the Bronze Age collapse and into the Iron Age, those would feel like monsters and most likely paved the way for some of our modern folkloric creatures and monsters as well. Seriously, I cannot stress this enough. The Iron Age is literally everything that Dungeons & Dragons tells you the adventurer's fantasy is. If you're looking for it in a historical setting, I promise you, it is in the Iron Age. But now that brings me to the misconceptions. We have already mentioned meteorite weapons. Again, Hollywood and pop culture would have you believe they are far more common and far more average than in actuality is the case. Now, these would have been highly expensive, very important. They would have been status symbols, less than actual weapons for use, although it is entirely plausible and possible that they were used. But again, think of them like high-priced commodities for the wealthy and the powerful elite. However, there are two more common misconceptions I want to address before we move on to using the Iron Age in our games, and that is that trade doesn't stop. It slows, and it changes. Now, I know that I painted the end of mercantilism and the infrastructure surrounding it during the Iron Age in pretty cataclysmic terms, and I do think that's true. But when there is desperation, there is a market. I want to draw your attention to this map right here. This is a map of areas that would have been tin deposits, tin being one of the essential metals for the smelting and creation of bronze. And I want to draw your attention to the follow-up to it, which is this map of trade and trade hubs smack dab in the middle of the Iron Age during this time. And you'll notice it's very, very, very similar. Now again, trade does almost collapse entirely on a global scale. Almost. But it doesn't quite. It changes and it shifts. You'll notice that not a lot of trade is going up to the areas where Cornwall was. Again, it's far less likely and far less important for us to make our way to Cornwall when we don't need it as much for bronze. However, trade does continue, trade develops, trade changes and shifts, and eventually it recovers. Again, this is an almost complete destruction, but not a total destruction. And speaking of total destruction, scholarship does not, end during this time. One of the big examples of this is the destruction of Mycenaean learning and Greek learning in general. We know that the Greeks, before the Bronze Age collapse and before the early Iron Age, did keep written records. They did write stuff down. However, there's a copious lack of those records and those written sources during the early Iron Age. And the reason for that is the collapse of Greek scholarship and the unalivement of many learned individuals throughout the Greek world, and actually just throughout the world in general during the Iron Age. However, there are some places that keep scholarship alive. Places like Egypt, for example, worked very hard to preserve its knowledge and its learning of the world and its inner workings, even during a time of such political and economic, social, ecological, and military upheaval as the Iron Age. So again, while scholarship does not completely end, it comes very cataclysmically close, but it doesn't end. And I would like you to avoid that. There is always a glimmer of hope, a glimmer of tenacity, and a glimmer of that good old-fashioned fighting human spirit that keeps the people of the Iron Age still alive and still kicking. And with that, we get to talk about the Iron Age in our games. One of the big things before I start getting into custom rules and custom things for your games that I want to talk about is that when you're running an Iron Age game, feel free to lean in on the tropes, because guess what? Those tropes make a ton of sense. Merchant needs to hire a bunch of guards for a trade caravan. Yeah, of course they do. Trade infrastructure is well and truly hosed. It's incredibly dangerous. There are bandits and desperate individuals, some of whom want to eat, some of whom want profit, some of whom just want to, end the world with a bang, whether that's yours or someone else's. And so, yeah, they're gonna bring on additional people. Oh, an important artifact is found in a lost ruined settlement. Yeah, there's a ton of lost ruined settlements, many of whom had powerful or important things that you need to get. The crown or a scepter, a symbol for leadership, might have been left behind when the royal family was dethroned and had to make a quick exit. Important charts, whether those are star charts for circumnavigation of the globe or maps of the land, need to be recovered. Hey, guess what? You could go to the ruins to do that. Yeah. And guess what? Those ruins were probably more recently created than anyone in your party is entirely comfortable with. Bandit army? You betcha. That's a real trope too. Ask the Assyrians. They had a ton of trouble with roving bandit armies of hill tribesmen during this time period and into the Iron Age. All of these tropes work because this time period is so set up for fantasy adventuring. So if you're going to make an Iron Age game, guess what? You can feel free to lean in on, adapt, and utilize the same tropes that you would use for your traditional middle-age fantasy game or medieval fantasy game, and you can put it in here, and guess what? It actually makes a lot more sense. But now that we've talked about this, let's talk about how we would use the Iron Age in our role-playing games. I'm going to venture out and actually give you a bunch of different ideas, and we're going to start with an adventure seed. One of the things that I find fascinating is during the Bronze Age's zenith and towards the end of the Iron Age, you get these sort of palatial boat palaces, these sort of incredible, Iron Age cruise ships, so to speak. This one would have been actually, I think this is an illustration of Caligula's, if I'm not mistaken. Now, I think this is absolutely fascinating because A, look at this, the idea that like ancient people had like, you know, a carnival cruise essentially, I think is absolutely fascinating, but it also lends for a fantastic little floating adventure. This is the Hyperion, a palace slash, you know, fallout shelter of sorts that was the last known location of an important imperial governor who ran off with the treasury. He saw the writing on the wall during the Bronze Age's collapse. He stole a bunch of money, amassed all of his trusted servants, mercenaries, and soldiers, put them all on a giant floating mansion, and decided that this was going to be how he rode out the apocalypse. And I love this because there's so many different ways that you can treat this mission. You could treat it as a heist. Perhaps the surviving members of the royal family have entrusted the party to regain the stolen valuables that this official took, and they have to break in. Or perhaps one of their friends was, you know, strong-armed into service on this ship, and they need to break them out. You could also treat this as a survival game. Perhaps they are servants or soldiers on board the ship when the Hyperion sets sail, and they are beset by raiders, monsters, horrible weather, and all manner of things that force them to contend with the powers that be. Or you could even just treat it as a good old-fashioned dungeon crawl, and what a unique and intriguing concept, but a giant floating mansion with all of the amenities gone horribly awry in the middle of the Iron Age. I absolutely love this, but what if you don't want an adventure seed? What if you're like, Kyle, I already have cool Iron Age concepts for an adventure or a game or a campaign that I want to run? What about some alternate abilities? Well, you will know that I am somebody who despises the flat stat buff. Gone are the days when I am impressed with a +1 modifier. I don't want it. If you're going to make alternate abilities happen, I think you should tie them to the information that is gathered, the wisdom that is recovered by your players as they venture out into the Iron Age and recover the fragments of civilization lost and bring it back to help civilization renewed. And there's a couple different ways that you can do this. You can just give all players spells, which I actually do think is kind of neat. I think opening up spellcasting to everybody is a cool concept. I've seen a bunch of RPGs do this pretty well, but I actually think giving targeted abilities is what you want to do, and you should tie them to the things that your players discover. Consider for a moment that we have talked about the rediscovery of all of these, you know, lost or supposedly lost exotic animals and exotic species during the Iron Age. What if the players going out for, I don't know, an Iron Age zoologist or a menagerie keeper, in doing so, they gain all kinds of abilities that are related to animals, like the ability to make hostile beasts docile, to deduce physical properties, or to harvest components from a beast with no harm to the creature, things that might regrow, like tusks or antlers, for example. Now, all of those I think are really cool ways, but what if your players spend a lot of time out on sea? And yes, I am aware that this is not technically an Iron Age ship, but you get the idea. But what if they spend a lot of time out at sea and they're battling, or they recover the lost secrets of maritime trade, ancient trade routes long thought lost, maps to help them navigate straits and dire waters, right? All of those things could lead to some really cool abilities, like once per round, if you're doing a lot of ship-based combat, giving the players the ability to double that movement of a ship, especially if you want to double it in a straight line, I think is really cool, or to increase turn radius, or to ascertain the hazardous locations of rocks within 2 miles. All of these become not just cool and unique abilities, but role-playing hooks for your players to sort of hang their hats on. You could even lean in to the trade secrets of the Iron Age smiths, and your players could be able to, as a combat ability, perhaps call upon the spirits of that iron weapon and have their enemies' weapons potentially break. This could be really powerful if you're doing a lot of big en masse combat, or like, you know, big army combat or skirmish combat, shall we say. A 10% chance for all of your opponent's weapons to break, as long as they're within the radius of the player, could be huge, but not as huge as the potential for the players to make their own iron weapons. And again, we have talked about these things as quasi-magical at the time, and it would have felt that way, but having a player with the knowledge, the wisdom, and the know-how to not just make a small fortune by selling those goods, but to turn the tide of history in favor of their allies is, I think, an amazing power. Again, you don't want to give your players static benefits, static buffs, the +2, the reroll. They're okay, right? But really what you want to do is you want to give your players something to hang their hats on, something that, you know, doesn't spell out everything for them, but does encourage them to start role-playing and to start considering who their character is and what their character might desire in an organic fashion. I think that's a really interesting way to do it, and if you are going to play around in the Iron Age, I really do think that what you should do is you should lean into the recovery of ancient treasures and, even more important, knowledge, and make that into its own reward. Now, with that out of the way, folks, this does bring us to the end of our video proper. I do hope you have enjoyed it. A shout out, of course, to our friends over at Tabletop Bookshelf. Again, they're not actually formally sponsoring this. I just really like the way they do business, and if you're going to buy a Desks and Dorks game, I would encourage you to do it from them or from any of our other phenomenal distributors. We work with Exalted Funeral, Indie Press Revolution, and Worldwide Distribution. All of them great folks and good friends, people that we enjoy working with. If you really want to help us out, again, all of the YouTube pleasantries, or if you're not a physical book person, you can get yourself a PDF by using that QR code or the link to itch in the description below. But with that out of the way, we will be moving on to the Q&A section. This is where I answer questions, not just from the YouTube comments, but also from members of our Discord. You can find the link down there as well. So if you're only here for our video proper, then this is where we part ways. I am Kyle for Desks and Dorks. You have been absolutely amazing, and I will see you in the next one. Oh, and do me a favor. Play some games in the Iron Age. Peace. Hello, Dad Bod. We did it. Got through another video. It's good to do this one. I feel like this is probably the best piece of content that I have made since the low fantasy video. So this is my new favorite piece of content other than the low fantasy video. So I loved this. I really hope that you guys enjoyed it. And yeah, let's talk a little bit about the Bronze Age. Kavadi asked, are there any speculations or models for what an the Bronze Age? It's not the Bronze Age. We're talking about the Iron Age. Are there any speculations or models for what an Iron Age would have looked like for parts of the world that never experienced one because of colonization? That is a phenomenal question, and to give a short answer to a long question, the answer is no. All we have is conjecture, right? We have no idea what an Iron Age might have looked like on those places, those civilizations, because they didn't happen, and as a result, right, we have to just use conjecture. I think a lot of some of the more uncontacted tribes, perhaps, that, you know, dot the Pacific, if they had an Iron Age, it might have actually looked very similar to Greece's Iron Age, where they sort of set up a shipping and maritime empire. Who would have known? Like, who knows? You know what I mean? The Maori probably could have had a really interesting Iron Age as well, given their proclivities for maritime travel and trade. So, I don't know. All it is conjecture. I imagine they would be very similar to Greece's, but again, there's some cultural and climate differences that might have stopped those. But that's my best guess, Kev. Iron Bones, where did the romance for metal go? That is a really good question, actually, and I think it speaks to a larger issue with human development and technological growth. I think Iron Bones, very fittingly, is something that was viewed as this sort of, as you put it very succinctly in the Discord, as a gift from the heavens. And now I think we have understood it and its base elements, literally its base chemical elements, its base composition. We know what it is, and we have sort of moved on to other stuff. I think the romance for it is gone, but I don't see that romance itself as gone. I see that romance has sort of just maybe moved on to other things and other subjects. It's part of the reason why I rail so heavily against AI in art in general, because I think that, like, by removing yourself from the creative process, you remove the chance to pour a part of yourself into that process, and I think that truly is where the romance has gone, at least in my mind. Granted, I am very biased. I make stories in games for a living. When did having a solid piece of whip-ass fall out of its place of honor? I don't think it has, at least here in the States. I think we have just replaced swords with guns as the thing that, like, we hinge our value on. And how can we bring back what we've lost? I think we just bring it back by enjoying the romance of something where we can find it, and where we can get it. I think it's, you know, I, for example, have a ore that like is engraved by members of my 4th grade class. When I was still teaching 4th grade, there was a running joke. I was a Boy Scout. And when it was people's birthday at Boy Scout camp, they would do this goofy song called We Are the Order of the Ore. And then they would get real close to somebody and go, is it your birthday? And if they were an adult, they'd go, And the adult goes, no. They go, that's okay. You've had too many already. And then they would run away. Basically, it was a huge, giant joke. I told the kids about it. The kids thought it was hilarious. And as a parting gift to me, that school year, they made me an oar. They bought an oar from like Hobby Lobby, and they all engraved it and signed it together. And so that hangs up somewhere. So again, maybe not a piece of meteorite iron forged as a weapon, but there's certainly a lot of good feelings for that. I think it's just a matter of transferring those feelings to those things. Alien Dragon XLII. I refuse to say your name as anything other than that, man. It's just wonderful and I love it. It's dramatic. Wasn't the behemoth, or the behemoth, in the Old Testament Torah described as having bones like tubes of bronze? Yes. It is entirely likely as well, depending on your source and setting, that they were either describing an elephant or a rhinoceros, depending on what translation of that story you're looking at, which is cool. It goes back to one of the things that I was talking about, obviously, about the idea that, maybe the rediscovery of animals is where we get a lot of our myths. But yes, it's actually one of my favorites. I love the myth of the Behemoth and the myth of the Leviathan that go along with it. Both of them, I think, are contained in Leviticus. I know the Leviathan is. I am not sure about the Behemoth. Carl Makes Stuff. Do we have an Iron Age equivalent of A. Nasir? No, we do not, Carl. I wish we did. Shout out to A. Nasir selling his, substandard copper. We loved him from the Bronze Age. But no, there is no Iron Age equivalent, at least not to my knowledge that there is not. And I think part of the reason is that, it's democratized. It's much easier to get into the iron production than it was to get into the copper production or the bronze production. And so as a result, if somebody did, screw you over on a business deal, it wasn't like you had no other options in the city or few other options. You had way more options. So I think there's actually less opportunity for an A. Nasir to sort of develop. That's conjecture, but of course. Okay, serious now, since bronze required a significant trade network, and iron mostly doesn't, did it lead to a change in social and political structures? Absolutely it did. We talked a little bit about the change of mercantile networks, about how all of that sort of shifted as a result of the movement away from bronze to iron. But again, it's one of those things that I think does lead to a greater democratization of it. And also, was there some prerequisite technology that needed to be developed to start working on iron, or is it just the case that no one had bothered as bronze was doing an okay job? I think partially, Carl, I think it's that it's not just that nobody else had done the job. I think it was that there was a sudden influx and an understanding of what iron could do. And then once one person did it and you understood how important it was, it just spread so rapidly. And so again, humans are constantly experimenting. I'm not sure if there's a single zenith point somewhere that leads to that. But again, I think it's just literally that bronze was doing an okay enough job until, like many technological innovations, it wasn't. And then all of a sudden the other technological innovation was everywhere. Or is it just, what's the deal with iron in the Fae? That's a really good question. I'm not entirely sure. It is sus, I agree, because iron is natural. I don't know. This is not a question I had even encountered a little bit in my research, because this was not about the Fae. So, Carl, I will have to do, I think, the good scholarly thing and tell you that for the first time, I don't even know if I have an idea. The best conjecture I can come up with is that yes, it's a natural substance, but in a lot of folklore and myth, you fight a natural enemy with a natural substance. That's the best thing I got right now. But yeah, I think that's pretty much it for the moment. The Adjudicator. Similar to Carl's question, in which ways did material, cultural, and religious identity change with the introduction of more widespread iron? Were representations of deities, sacrament paraphernalia, and idols that were once made of bronze and copper made with iron, or was there a shift representing spiritual things towards iron? I don't actually think there is, and here's why, because, iron has a practical purpose, you know what I mean? You don't want to go back to using a bronze plow after you've got an iron one. You're not going to go back to using bronze shields once you've got an iron shield or an iron-tipped spear. However, the use of religious paraphernalia is oftentimes sort of layered with the traditions and the history that go along with it. This means, I think, as a result, that you're far less likely to swap out an iron chalice, a bronze chalice, for an iron one, or iron ornamentations, are going to replace the bronze ornamentations that your priesthood wears. simply because the traditions are so baked into it, and tradition and ritual are so hugely important to religion, whether we're talking about modern religion or historical religion. So I genuinely think that there wasn't a shift in the material stuff. In terms of like the rise of new gods, it would be interesting to see. Again, this isn't something I know for sure, but I would not be shocked if there was some sort of shift in the sort of work that a pantheon did, like a craftsman deity being represented by, emblems of a bronze worker, but then, an ironsmith, either the icons of the iconography and ironsmithing replacing that one. I do think that might happen as well. And as Carl points out, iron does get reused and recycled a lot, and that is true of pretty much every expensive metal that required craftsmanship to make, maintain, and use. So it is possible too. So take a sip of my hydration. Thanks to Diet Coke for powering me. Academy asks, I don't have a specific question about the Iron Age. I'm just hoping you mentioned the Latena culture and the way of the Celtic expansion influenced the rise of Rome, both technologically as well as their cultural nemesis and boogeyman, all the way into the Empire. I did not. Although, Cadme, as you very wisely point out, the Celtic Iron Age is a hugely significant thing and does in many ways kind of help to fuel Rome and also to fuel the demise of the Celts as a people, or at least the demise of their hegemony of that area. Because like what happens is like the Celts they have bronze, the bronze stops working, they get iron, the iron starts working, they start raiding. This encourages the Romans to militarize, the Romans raid the Celts militarize in response to the Romans, then the Celts raid the Romans of course remilitarize in a greater extent as a response to the Celts, and this goes back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, basically until the Celts are wiped out. Not wiped out is probably the wrong, subjugated is probably the correct terminology for it. So there is your mention, my friend. I did not mention it as I tried to keep things as not general, but like as more specific to the age itself rather than how the age got into the nitty gritty in a specific region. But I do think you are correct in bringing up that the Celts had a very big hand in helping to fuel Rome's growth, and as a result helping to fuel the growth of the Iron Age everywhere. So I think that's a good thing to point out. Chris Bates, the ancient world was to bronze as the rise of Christianity is to iron. Discuss. Yeah, I mean, if anything, Christianity is a perfect example for that because it grows and changes, but it's still distinctly itself. So you could even say that Christianity is kind of like the rise of iron into the rise of steel. But yeah, I think that's it. Why do we have a Bronze Age and an Iron Age, but not a Steel Age? At least if we do, I didn't get the memo, as Carl brought up. And I think it's that reason, right? Like, you need iron to make steel. You do not need bronze to make iron. You do not need bronze to make steel. I think it's that iron is seen not as its own unique Pokemon, but as its own historical Pokemon evolution. And I think that's probably why. Chris Bates again asked, did the reliability of iron lead to more expansionist regimes and empires than earlier in the Bronze Age? No, at first. No at first. And the reason that it's a no at first is all of the stuff that we discussed at the beginning of the Iron Age, the upheavals, the cataclysms, the population loss, the starvation, the lack of information, the destruction of an informed and educated bureaucracy. All of those things wind up making it so that like expansion becomes impossible because we're just trying to stay alive. And so that's probably why. Also, are we now really in the aluminum age, or has the silicon age truly begun, as iron-derived steel is still the backbone of most of the industry? I would argue that we are, I guess you could call it the silicon age. I would argue that we are in the information age, more so than anything else, Chris. And I think the reason for that is that the biggest trade commodity right now isn't necessarily money or wealth, it's reputation and it's clout. I think you can look at the current political landscape here at the US and be like I truly don't think anybody elected our current president because of his political acumen. I think people elected him because he is charismatic and he is good at telling a story and he is phenomenal at dunking on people in a debate. I don't think that people turned away from somebody like our previous president because of his policies. I think some people did, but I think the majority of it is he is an old doddering man who lacked charisma, and again I think lacked that clout. This happens more now in the age of TikTok and YouTube and Twitter or X, whatever you want to call it, of Discord. One of the big things that we talk about in business, one of the literally I think the biggest moving force in business and in marketing right now is the rise of micro influencers, who are people who have a rabid or at the very least organic community that they're tapped in with. Because I think what people are realizing in the information age is it's not like you can just pour money into a product and it just works. People have to have some sort of buy-in, and so you either need to have an immense sense of personal charisma, or you have to have invested in a community that has similar mindsets to you and continues to get that content from you. I genuinely believe, I know we're getting really off topic here, but I genuinely believe that we're in the information age, more than anything else. Actually, a bunch of US policymakers now do most of their quote unquote fireside chats on TikTok, which is crazy. So again, all of that is, maybe you could say we're in the Silicon Age. I think we're in the information age. More than anything else. Invalid Salad asked if it's possible to answer briefly how and when did ransoming start to develop in the Iron Age into becoming closer to the dynamic we observe in the medieval period. And I will start by answering this question. It doesn't start in the Iron Age. It starts in the Bronze Age. Actually, a ransom culture has existed in some way, shape, or form pretty much as long as human beings have been around and been alive. I think the reason that it starts to grow and develop into the system that we see in the Middle Ages in Valid Salad is because of the importance of nobles, or the landed gentry, the elite, as not just political leaders, but as economic leaders as well, and of the close interpersonal relationships that they enjoy. Ransom culture only works if you don't hate the person that you're ransoming enough, that the money overrules the amount that you want to remove them from the life stream, right? Something to take into account in especially in the Middle Ages, right, is there is a degree of familiarity in a lot of the cases where people are ransomed back for vast sums of money, right? Like we think of Richard the Lionheart, who gets ransomed back, but he gets ransomed back by the Spanish crown, who knew him, right? Like he had, I wouldn't say that they were best friends. Obviously they're clashing, they're enemies at the time, or at least, enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of stuff, but they tangentially had an acquaintanceship with each other. They were familiar with one another, right? And so it starts in the Bronze Age as leaders of city-states start to get to know each other in some way, shape, or form, and they're like, well, I hate him, but do I hate him enough that his removal from the life stream overrides the vast sums of money and political clout that I will get in response? I think that is my best guess on that, and I think that's it. And when it comes to TTRPGs, how do you think you would implement ransoming mechanics and story in a way that would not reduce the stakes, i.e. players are not afraid of dying or not caring? Oh man, all you have to do, I think, in order to make sure your players remember the stakes in Valid Salad is have one player or one NPC that they really care about, and they think they're going to get ransomed, and that's just the time that the enemy hates them more than they're worth. And I think all of a sudden that adds the stake. There should always be an air of uncertainty, right? Even among those, I just mentioned the acquaintanceship and the level of familiarity between these individuals in the Middle Ages. But even then, nobody wanted to get captured. You weren't trying to get captured. Right? You didn't know for a fact that your enemies were going to let you go. That would have been crazy. But yeah, I would every so often I would remind them that they are fallible and mortal, and that it could come for them at any time. And I would start probably with an NPC that they like. Maybe not love, but like. That's just me. Is there anything unique that you could use to theme the stakes or narrative surrounding a narrative that would feel more exclusive to an Iron Age period? Cataclysm, upheaval, and crisis. All of those things. If you're wondering what kind of crisis in Valid Salad, all of them. The Iron Age is oops all crisis. That's really all it is, right? Oh, we have ecological crisis, done. Environmental cataclysm, done. Massive famine, done. Loss of the political class that has any idea what they're doing, done. Destruction of our standing army because we can't feed our people, done. Just oops all crisis. That's what I would do. Apprentice Salesman, what were some major artistic aesthetic movements that started with the Iron Age which differed from the Bronze Age? This is a phenomenal question. Finally, an art history question. Yeah, buddy. I know that I come off as one of those people that is more of a military historian, but I really think that cultural history is the most useful thing that you can have as a GM. So Apprentice Salesman, I'm so happy that you asked this question. And I will tell you right now, the most major artistic and aesthetic thing that I can think of off rip, and I don't know if it is the most important, like I don't know if every scholar would say this, but at least to my mind, ornamentation becomes so much more common, at least around this time, or maybe that it's not more common, but maybe that elements of it have remained as archaeological evidence because people use iron in their ornamentation, right? Bronze was used in ornamentation, but again, it was usually for the wealthy elite. However, because iron is cheaper to make, much faster to mass produce, you don't need to have quite as many skills to do it, and it doesn't have to come from as far away to get it done. Means the common folk can experiment with things like jewelry, with body modification, and with the sort of art that they wear, the sort of, presentation that they have in a personal sense. And I think that's a really big artistic and aesthetic movement that differs heavily during this time. And that would be my big thing, right? Jewelry, like torques and anklets, wristbands, rings, necklaces, brooches, pendants, piercings of all kinds. All of those things are massive during this time period. So that would be my recommendation. What a great question. Wow. Man, I love art questions. That's so good. Lilliputian asked, what were the initial types of items people created when the iron was first introduced? I don't know if it was the first. I will tell you, Lily, that I think farm implements are by far and away the most important of those implements. Because again, when your population is starving en masse, yes, you can make a really nice sword with it, but your first thought is probably not, wow, this iron can be used to make a sword. It's probably, wow, this iron can be used to make a phenomenal plow. And so I don't know if they were the first, but my guess, Lily, is that they're going to be farming implements. I think that's probably the first ones. That would be I would bet money on that. Again, hard to tell, hard to say. I didn't find, evidence one way or the other, like if a weapon came first or a toy came first or, jewelry came first. My guess is it's farming equipment. It's the things that people need in their everyday life. Maybe combs might be the only other thing that I could think of, or like a toothpick, something along those lines. Sir Loxodon Prince, what are your thoughts on the cultural exchanges, hybridization of kingdoms and empires as borders were in turmoil, and the theories of ethnogenesis, like the Philistines, the Neo-Babylonians, and the Assyrians? Oh my god. This should have been its own section, and I'm realizing now that I kind of whiffed on that one, but, this video is probably like an hour and a half long at this point. I'll have to go back through and see how much footage I actually recorded for the Iron Age. But yeah, my thoughts on it were it's a underrated, critically important, and vastly overlooked feature of the Iron Age, because like this sort of cross-cultural pollination is what paves the way for the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. Beyond that would be my thing. So also new tool developments leading to expansions in agriculture in parts of the Aegean and Iberia as urban centers were gutted by sickness and famine in the Near East. Thoughts? Well, Loxodon, if you've gotten to this part in the video, my man, you will know I had many thoughts. It got its own section, and it was not just Iberia and the Aegean. Like famine hits everywhere at this time, and again, iron winds up being, I think, used as a farming implement more so than anything else. Hopefully, I think in the minds of those people who are experiencing that as a way of helping to do that. Masked Bandit, what is the oldest iron forge we've ever found? His name is Iron Bones, and he lives in my Discord. That's the oldest one. Let me see. I actually am going to Google this because I don't actually know the answer to this question. And that's a good question. I don't know. Oldest iron forge found. That's crazy. How did I not even guess this? A tertiary glance says somewhere around like the 900s BCE. That is what a tertiary glance at the Google says, Masked Bandit. I will have to continue to look at that a little bit more. So we'll continue on. And yeah, we're gonna move on. So, okay, we had a very fun conversation. By the way, shout out to Empty Noggin for doing that conversation all about the cool stuff that happened in the Bronze Age. I gotta scroll down. And then we just talk all about how I hate Rome. I don't hate Rome, actually. I think Rome's vastly fascinating. Not great people, but they're vastly fascinating. All right, and with that being done, we go to the YouTube comments. Oh, man. Again, if you guys are still sticking around, I really hope you are. This is a long comment section. There are a lot of good questions. Shout out to you guys for doing all this fun stuff. Philip Mead, 7789, asked, what are some indirect effects of moving from bronze, which needed trade networks, to bring uncommon minerals together, to make an ally to iron, which is more widespread? Did countries become less connected, or did they just change? They just changed. I think we covered this pretty well in the video, but yeah, they just changed, Philip. And in a lot of ways, too, it's a democratization of that process, right? Again, you don't need to have... It's easier for a period of wealthy elites to form when you have the ability to control a resource. But yeah, it certainly leads to... not an Iron Age middle class, but it certainly leads to a democratization of both the skills needed for iron crafting, as well as the resources. Jack Thunderbolt 4307 asked, how does cavalry develop post-Bronze Age? Oh boy, does it develop pretty well. Eventually the stirrups get made in China. That's part of it, and those eventually spread to the West. That's a huge part about cavalry. But the thing that we talk about a lot, and the reason I talked about the Scythian female cavalry elite in the Bronze Age video, is that horses just don't have the musculature that we think they do to become cavalry until much later into the Bronze Age, or the Iron Age. But yeah, so post Bronze Age, it is a change in technology, the stirrup, and it is the development of horses into a more robust fighting animal that really winds up being a huge thing. Hella on Wheels asked, I guess I'd like to know what exactly was up with meteoric iron. Did people actually see meteorites impact and go look for the stuff while it was still glowing? Yes, that is exactly what they did. And before people start being like, there's no way a human is that stupid, I would like to point out that on Jägermeister it says, do not mix with caffeine, and the first thing we did was mix it with Red Bull to make Jaeger bombs. We are not a species built to last. That's exactly what we would do. Let's go look at the glowing space rock. Of course we would. And how did they use it once they found it, given that they couldn't create the temperatures to melt it? They could, in a lot of ways. There are things like crucible furnaces that have existed. Again, the oldest iron forge, according to this tertiary Google glance, was 730 BCE, but that's the oldest one that we have evidence of, right? And we have iron tools that I think are older than that. So my guess, my man, is that they probably just tried a lot of stuff to melt it down and smelt it down, which... at this point, who knows? The idea of maybe humans trying to use a volcano to smelt meteorite iron is entirely plausible, given what I know about human beings. Again, yes, they would go touch the space rock. Also, on the topic of volcanoes, did you guys know that Hernan Cortez, when he was attacking the Aztecs, literally stripped the sails from his ship to rappel into the volcano to get the chemicals needed to make saltpeter and gunpowder? What? That's news to me. That's insane. So yeah, the idea of, maybe that's a good quest for you all. Put your Iron Age people, get them the meteorite iron, have them realize there's no mortal fire that's hot enough to do it, and have them rappel into an active volcano to forge a sword. That's so cool. Someone please do that. That sounds great. High Lord Dorkstar asked, what does Iron Age mean? You have British Iron Age hill forts, but isn't Rome technically also Iron Age? How do you recognize Iron Age from other periods? How do you isolate one time period? So, Iron Age, again, what does Iron Age mean, High Lord Darkstar? In general, it means that time period from 1200 to 550, that is where iron really starts to develop as the core and most important thing. Now, however, I know that's not a satisfactory answer, and I think it's not a satisfactory answer because you are hitting on something that I have pointed out in many videos before. How do you isolate one time period? And the truth of the matter is, you don't. We, as humans, like to categorize things. It is an artifact of how our brains work functionally. On a psychological perspective, the human mind likes to create order where there is none. And so we like to order things, even historical time periods, and into epochs based on the important events that transpired during those times. But truly, we can't isolate a time period, right? I lived through Y2K, but I don't associate my life with Y2K or the 90s, which I've lived through both of those things. I was alive for blue ketchup, for the potential end of technology, and for an attempted insurrection all in the US. And to me, that's not all separate time periods. That's just been my life, right? It all kind of blends together. And I think, truthfully, that is sort of the thing, right? And people in the Middle Ages did not see themselves as part of the Middle Ages. They saw themselves as individuals just living through things. So I think you have hit on a much bigger and much more important point, High Lord Darkstar, which is I don't think you truly can isolate one time period. We can only, as historians, as scholars, and ultimately as people, I think just try our darndest and our best to make the most of it that we can, study what we can, and learn what we must from the people that came before. My 2 cents. sbang.s.a9761. How did the Iron Age affect the northern part of Europe? I think you mean Europa and not Europea. But a lot. I mean, again, in some ways, the Iron Age stops having or changes what the trade hubs are in Europe. We talked about how Cornwall was much less of an important trading hub post Bronze Age into the Iron Age. So it does shift the trade hubs a little bit. But also, I think in general, it makes it so that, warfare is a little bit more common, a little bit more deadly. We use them for farming implements, we use them for personal expression. So how did it change it? In pretty much every way imaginable once human ingenuity sort of gets into effect. What was Iron's effect on superpowers empire? Did the ones from the Bronze Age prosper, or were they replaced by new ones? The answer is a mix of both. The ones in the Bronze Age that were reeling post-Bronze Age, some of them still exist. Egypt exists long after the Iron Age is finished. Egypt is still around now, obviously, although in a greatly different capacity, obviously. But there are some empires like them that continue to last and continue to move forward. There are others like the Minoans, I do believe, drop out somewhere around the Iron Age too. I'll have to double check my times on that. But yeah, like there's a Greek Dark Age, so a lot of Greek city-states were completely and totally snuffed out. The Assyrians fall during this time, the Babylonians fall during this time, and they wind up becoming other things, like elements of them wind up, forming sort of different Arabic and Muslim states later on in history. So some last, some don't, I think is the short answer to that question. Why did the Iron Age not take off earlier? Oh, this is from W4IPH. Why did the Iron Age not take off earlier if it does not require complex trade networks and economic systems to maintain the Bronze Age? Why did the Iron Age not take off earlier if it does not require... It does. It does require those trade networks. I mean, we showed you the map, but the trade networks literally exist and happen. Like, they basically just sort of like shunt out bronze and replace it with iron for most of it. But yeah, you still do need those trade networks, I think, in some way, shape, or form. It just democratizes it and makes it so that it's more widespread. That's all. And what changes can we make in our world building to keep the world in Bronze Age stasis? And what things may advance without access to iron? I think, barring magic and divine intervention, I don't think any campaign world can remain in stasis. And I know that probably feels like a cop-out answer, but yeah, I think it's impossible. If you want, if for no other reason, then humans are beings of chaos and change, and you are presumably allowing players into your world, and so change, I think, is inevitable if you are following things in an organic fashion, in an organic way. That being said, if you are going to make a world in stasis, you would have to give people a reason not to use the superior technology. Perhaps everybody in your world is magical, and iron has anti-magical properties, which means that like the use of iron is very painful for them, or maybe it dampens their powers or their connection to the earth, whatever kind of power you'd have. That would be how I would do it. But again, that we're leaning a little bit more into the fantastical there. So, just my thing. Just my 2 cents. Right, and then I think... a billion people mentioned Tyranny from Obsidian. I've played Tyranny. It's great. That's it. Okay, and I think that's actually it. That's all the questions. Wow, you guys asked a ton of questions for the Iron Age. I really, really hope that you all enjoyed this. I know, again, if this is your first time watching, our Q&A sections generally tend to be just a little bit more of the off the cuff, off kilter, sort of just a conversation between you and me. But I hope that you stuck around for this. You guys asked some insane and incredible questions this time around. So I really, genuinely, sincerely appreciate it. If you liked this video, please share it. This is the single best way to help me out. The more it gets shared, the more eyes that get on it, the more people like what we do, and the more people like what we do, the more I think things go well for the channel. So if you really want me to continue to do deep dives like this, sharing it is the single best way to help me, because yeah, if people stop watching these, I have to find other content to make, and I don't want to make other content. I really like this. So in any case, that's pretty much it. But thank you all so sincerely much for sticking around. I really do appreciate it. But yeah, I'm Kyle out for Desks and Dorks. You guys are absolutely amazing. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.